everyone, and welcome back to another segment of our virtual symposium, Disruptions, Breaks, and Ruptures. With me today is Emeka Okafor, who is reimagining ecosystems. And Emeka is also the TED Global Curator and the co-founder of TED Fellows. Emeka, no.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, today we're going to have a conversation around innovation and ingenuity as heritage, a need for recovery and directions for the future. So I have some questions to ask you. The first one is, what is the connection between heritage and ingenuity?
Well, thank you, Shoma, for having me. It's a delight to be part of this event. I always hoped that I could attend it physically in London, and I was looking forward to having attended in Nsukka, but here we are. Yes, the question about heritage and innovation is something that many of us ponder because we try to ask the question, where does innovation actually come from? Too often, the term innovation comes across as a buzzword, something that is seen as icing on the cake, something that is external, not intrinsic. And because, particularly in Africa in general, but in Southeast Nigeria and in Igbo land in particular, the term innovation is seen as something with an otherness attached to it. People don't see it as something that speaks to who they are from within. And if you do not focus on that intimate connection of it being something that is intrinsic to your being, it's something that doesn't seem natural. It's something that you can't really build upon because it's coming from a place that is not that connected to who you are. So for me, I like to challenge myself and ask, what do we mean when we define innovation from an Igbo standpoint? And unfortunately, this isn't subject matter that has been discussed as much as it should, but there are those who have begun to ask those questions and provide some sort of visual trail of clues to help us answer those questions. I'd like to start with a thread from a site called Uburu. For those who might not be familiar, it's spelled UKPURU. And this particular thread is titled Innovations from the Igbo Area, focusing on indigenous structures, indigenous social structure as it relates to technology, arts, and architecture. And I'm not going to linearly go through this entire thread because it's fascinating. But for me, in my sort of questioning the subject of innovation as it pertains to that part of Nigeria, I find it to be foundational, because if we're to get to grips with the essential necessity of innovation and its relevance, we need to know where we are coming from, where we are, and where we wish to go. And in this particular thread, it starts off with a photograph of this 4,000-year-old iron slag heap in a place called Leja. And I might be mispronouncing it, but it's spelled
you got it. It's Leja.
And it also highlights the Ibuku and Ezira bronzes. And in addition, it speaks to, it has some photographs that point us to this Y-shaped currency known as Atla. That is also from a different time frame. So when you look at this thread and those three instances that I spoke to, we're looking at 4,000 years, maybe 900 years, and maybe going back 100 or a couple hundred years. And in each of those instances, we see physical objects that were the were the outcome of processes that dealt with ingenuity, and ingenuity that was refined, that was turned into products. And I think one of the most tangible ones is the Y-shaped currency piece called APBA, because it's a product that is used as an exchange of value, which is what currencies are. So for me, these three items and that thread, I really recommend very strongly people go to see it, sort of speak to ingenuity that was intrinsic to the societies that produced them. What then happened, and I'm not a historian, so I'm not going to speak with the sort of authority of a historian. What then happened when we encountered the colonialists is that that thread was broken and devalued. So we went from a place where there was a tremendous amount of ingenuity in various areas, and the three examples I gave were in the metalworking area, to a place where for civilizational reasons, the colonizers felt that they didn't want competition with their own metalwork, nor did they want any other form of currency, et cetera, et cetera. And these links to this system of ingenuity were broken and devalued and sort of taken down more than a few notches to the point where they didn't exist. So when we think of the type of ingenuity that existed up to 4,000 years ago, back to about 900 years ago with Ibuku, and a few hundred years ago prior to the advent of colonialism, you can see that the period when we had actually intrinsic ingenuity went back almost 10 millennia. And here we are a couple of hundreds of years, maybe a few hundred years or two from colonialism to a place where it seems as if that ingenuity has vanished. And this was ingenuity that was fundamental to the society. It wasn't like some add-on that was being sprinkled, or let's do some innovation and have some innovation meet up. No, this was ingenuity that drove the society. So when I speak to ingenuity and heritage, and if we look at other societies, whether it's the Japanese and their steel making, or various groups in Scandinavia and their cheese making, the idea of being creative and attaining that creativity, allowing you to ideate, and from the ideation, you become inventive, and that inventiveness then leads to tangibility, which is what products are. You can always see how they always look back to whether it's the Japanese steel, or it's the cheese making abilities of the Scandinavians, or it's the wine brewing from the Mediterranean. And that lineage is critical because it's embedded in who they are. So if we're to talk about ingenuity, we're to talk about innovation, and to give us a sense that it's something that comes from within, it's very important to look at where we were coming from. Because if we're now going to look at where we are today and where we might be in the future, the extent to which we're able to recover that base ingenuity is essential if we're going to see it as something that we can take into the future. And as you said in the title, which is innovation and ingenuity as heritage,
yeah.
And a need for recovery, the recovery I'm speaking to is looking at what happened before and then sort of taking it to where we are now and saying, well, we're sort of molding it into something that it has utility today. And it's that foundation that we can then move into the future. So heritage is intrinsic, and in some cases it was always there, but we ended up losing most of it. And it's that basis that we will need to use if we're looking to build the type of innovation society that we all hope to have, not just now and in the future. So I don't know if that answers the question, but
it
that was
actually does. And it reminds me of the saying, how do you know where you're going if you don't know where you've come from?
Exactly.
Yeah.
You know, one of the earliest blog posts I made, it seems so long ago, was I think in 2004, 2003. And it was a post where I was highlighting an article about how Africa missed its industrialization. And one of the points that was made in that particular post was that when up till the time we obtained independence in many African countries, our elite overlooked and devalued the very things that other societies had sort of built upon when they were thinking about how they were going to industrialize. And some of this wasn't the fault of the elites at the time, the political elite in Nigeria and other countries. Some of it was the result of, as I mentioned earlier, an intent around the colonial powers to devalue any technologies that we had and sort of, quote unquote, strangle them in the bed. And so we had this big rupture that sort of made us not see these things as intrinsic to who we are. And what we've been doing ever since is scrambling, thinking that innovation is something we can import from elsewhere. But to import things, you need to understand the basics. But if you don't even understand the basics, how are you going to build on top of anything?
On top of what's available, yeah.
So yes, that's how I would characterize it.
Okay, yeah. Okay, Biafra was a seminal moment from a science and technology perspective. When you have the research and, I think, research and development section that was able to carry, you know, the country for over 30 months. What do you think we might learn from that experience?
I think there's so much value in the Biafra science and technology experience that we must examine more closely. You know, when we speak about this chain of ingenuity, that was another place where the chain was broken. It was also a period where, you know, the chain was broken, then this ingenuity momentarily reappeared during the Biafran War. And they reappeared because of pressure, they reappeared because of necessity. But that period of science and innovation, and not just products, but things that worked, albeit for purposes of combat and some in purposes of logistics, is unparalleled in Igbo history and in Nigerian history. This oversight, the oversight of not acknowledging what happened during the Biafran War, is even something that was recently acknowledged by Nigeria's current vice president, Yemi Osibanjo. He lamented earlier this year, he lamented the inability of Nigeria, I'm quoting, to leverage on the engineering and technological ingenuity that emanated from the defunct Republic of Biafra during the Civil War. It's somewhat bittersweet to have that kind of lamentation 50 years after the fact. Nonetheless, in some ways, it's a useful acknowledgement to have, because when we throw around terminology about research and science and technology and emerging countries and so forth, one of the key aspects we do not seem to recognize is that necessity of survival, which in many cases comes from war, is one of the biggest drivers of technological progress. It's not something that people like to acknowledge, because we associate, rightly so, war and battles with death, destruction, and suffering. But there are those who argue that one of the reasons Europe was able to dominate the rest of the world for over half a millennia is that they had so honed the tools of war, and they were so tightly bound in killing each other, that when they were then unleashed on societies that didn't have that level of endless ingenuity and innovation, they were unstoppable. And we saw a glimpse of that during the Biafran War. The science and technology organization, whose name escapes me, but we can put a link to that on, down somewhere at the end of this talk, encapsulated the best of what could be done under pressure, because people's lives were at stake.
Yeah.
Whether it was their Obunigwe weapon systems, which in the hands of other societies would have formed the basis of a defense industry, which in the hands of others would have formed the basis of a major weapons manufacturer. And once again, I don't want to harp too much on the death and destruction aspect of weaponry, but I think it's important for we as Igbo, as Africans, as Nigerians, to look at what the West has done with these industries. The very Nobel Prize that even the peace-loving people nominate people for was founded by Alfred Nobel. Alfred Nobel made his fortune from explosives. If anything, the Nobel Prize was established as a salve to his conscience. Oh, wow. It wasn't stated explicitly, but there's a very tightly bound connection between the tools of how we can defend ourselves and the foundation of science and technology. But beyond the weapon systems, like the various explosive devices used during the war, there was a tremendous amount of refining going on, because in the Southeast, they didn't have access to refineries for purposes of fuel that they would use in their transport systems. So that was a missed opportunity. After the war, Nigeria founded an organization called PRODA. But unfortunately, PRODA never lived up to its promise. And these reasons, one could argue, range from strategic neglect to an misunderstanding of how commercialization and innovation work. And why is this important? There is this constant confusion within Nigeria about invention, ingenuity, and commercialization and innovation. They're not the same thing. I remember growing up in Enugu, and every now and then would go to one of these trade fairs, and I think it was Polo Park.
Yeah, it was opposite Polo Park.
Yeah, so opposite Polo Park in Enugu. And they would wheel out these Gary frying machines from PRODA periodically, but it never sort of moved beyond the prototype. Something was missing. Something was not there to turn the process from the ingenious prototype to the product. And what was somewhat sad is that those who knew how to do it took that basic understanding, mostly from the Far East, and started producing the product that we in Nigeria ended up buying, and by default putting foreign exchange in the pockets of others. So
I remember, like the yam pounder. There was a time, the yam pounder, and I remember thinking, why are we importing yam pounder from? I think it was Japan or China, one of those places.
Exactly, they don't eat yam.
They don't eat yam.
but they must have made an observation that we do, and we eat a lot of pounded yam. And I wouldn't be surprised if they came across these prototypes that came out of places like PRODA. So Nigeria lost out in not building upon what, quote unquote, the defeated side had come up with. It was a big oversight. Many people, I'm sure, are familiar with America's Apollo program, which launched men to the moon. The Apollo program was essentially built on the knowledge of German scientists that Americans captured after World War II. Werner von Braun was the person who ran America's Apollo program. He was a German. I'm not sure if he was a Nazi. The point I'm trying to make here is that our short-sightedness at the time actually undermined what could have been tremendous progress. And I think there's a lesson to be learned from that. So anyway, in terms of Biafra itself, it was a shining example of what could have been from a technological standpoint, because when they designed these tools, they had to work. Okay, they might not have worked perfectly, but they couldn't sit around and discuss whether the person who designed it had a PhD or not. It either worked or it didn't. And I think the history of that effort from a technological, scientific standpoint should be explored more usefully, because when we come to today and we begin to discuss what should happen tomorrow, we'll begin to see how it all sort of happened then, and hopefully learn lessons from that process.
Unfortunately, most of the people that were active around that time, I'm not sure I don't know if a lot of them are still around, or even if they had notes to what they used, during, the war, but that's the story for another day. Okay.
Actually, there's a book that was written about that research center, but I'll provide details for that. I haven't read it yet, so I don't know how detailed it is, but it could be a starting point.
Yeah. And you also, you keep hearing, so many problems in Nigeria, but you also wonder, as you said, nobody has ever thought of going back to what worked then to now, sort of use it to solve the problems of now. Yeah. Okay. Do you think innovation is critical to our future, and what its relevance was in the past? Although you've touched on it, like talking about the ledger, and then walking us through how, with the Ibuku bronze, and but how do you think a society should become sustainably prosperous?
Well, it is quite relevant when we begin to look at where we are today and where we might want to go. So, to use concrete examples, the foundation for Igbo business and trade, one could argue, is around the cities of Onitsha, Nnewi, Aba, and other places, but those are sort of the main fundamentals engines. And one of the main drivers in those three cities is commerce, the exchange of goods, and to varying degrees manufacturing between Aba and Nnewi. Commerce is increasingly moving away from physical interactions. It's been somewhat amplified by what we're living through today with COVID. Many individuals across the world who wouldn't even consider the idea of working virtually or using products and services that are virtual have been forced to do so, even in Nigeria. So prior to COVID and it being a function that is forcing people to act in a certain way, there were other currents that were beginning to undermine some of the advantages that these markets had. Alibaba, the Chinese behemoth, the massive Chinese Amazon equivalent, what do? they trade products. And if you go to Alibaba, they might not have varieties of egusi seeds or gyochi and all of that, but how unlikely is it that they won't in the future? And as more and more people, even in the remotest parts of Nigeria, the remotest parts of Igbo and everything else begin to become comfortable with these tools that allow us to transact and exchange funding without being face-to-face. As these things evolve, who do you think is going to be marginalized here? One of those constituencies, over time, maybe not immediately, will be the very big, that very substantial group of stakeholders who trade. Will it go completely virtual? Maybe not in the next generation or so, but a substantial amount of trade is going to move from how it's being done now to where it could be done, or how it's going to be transacted in the future. And that erosion of numbers is going to affect those who rely solely on face-to-face trade. So the question becomes, to what extent is that demographic that could be affected by this issue beginning to consider how it might affect them? Or are they going to be blindsided because they didn't make the effort to see this as a threat? Secondarily, as we know in Nigeria, we're moving from an economy that was based largely on oil revenues to one that is having to diversify, and one that is having, by diversification, also looking to export a large amount of products, or an increasing amount of products. It's a very different ball game where you bring things from outside and you sell them within. You open Ibubata container, as you know, to now having the structure and systems to compete as an exporter. It's the skill sets are completely different. Not to say they don't require diligence, hard work, adaptability, and a sense of seeing opportunities where they lie, which Igbo traders are good at. India are unparalleled in that sense, but it's a different set of problems. And innovation is required because to understand how it's done, you have to think differently, but you also need a substantial understanding of the tools that are used in other parts of the world where global export excellence is a marker. And I say that because we have to look at who will we be competing against over the next 10, 20 years. Nigeria just joined AFTA, AFCTA, which means that maybe not immediately, but over time, our borders are going to be less controlled, and we're going to be subject to more competition. So innovation is critical for the Southeast because the land is shifting beneath our feet. The things that were considered the purview of the commerce generating engines are going to be flipped on their head. Because oil is going down in value, and export and foreign exchange is going to be determined by what you produce and what you manufacture and what you export, there's certain need for standards that you might be able to get away with when all you were doing is breaking open a container and having people come and buy things. So innovation is critical. If the merchants, the manufacturers, the importers who will not be importing as much now have to look at markets that are very different to the ones we have today. So, but I see this as an opportunity. I see it as an opportunity for those who are quote unquote working with certain tools to work with this group of traders and business people who provide the foundation of commerce in the Southeast. And hopefully, if we're able to work well enough together, we can say, we can be looking to having Igbo corporations that are like Alibaba, that are not just focused on their success in a narrow subset of the country or the country itself, but are just as comfortable selling items to people in Japan as they are to people in a way.
And at the heart of it is also transport and logistics. So all these sort of things that are currently impeding, sort of manufacturing, and so any thought of manufacturing and exportation can't even go far until they figure out how to move these goods, essentially.
True, and I think this is where we may need to have thinking that taps into the collective resources of the diaspora from a financial sense to build those critical corridors. Not everything, but the critical corridors. Financing mechanisms that say, well, yes, to what extent can we finance the dredging of the Niger privately? Because if we can do that, then we can use barges to move containers from places like Onitsha out to seaports. This is not, government has a role to play. Without government, certain things just will not happen. But there is an opportunity to think about things differently and be very sort of focused at critical aspects of infrastructure that could be financed privately. I had no idea that some of the oldest ports in Germany and canals in Germany were actually financed by merchants 200-300 years ago.
No, I didn't know that.
With the assistance of the state. But the point being is that government must play a role, but there's a lot that a combined private sector and diaspora could do if it was very focused and intentional. And that is something I hope these conversations will open up.
Will open up, yeah. So are there, because I know you're a big time maker, and a lot of people, when they saw that you were you're going to participate in this event, were like, oh, the king of the makers. So could you tell us if there are examples of contemporary innovation in the Southeast and its diaspora that you would like to share with us?
Yeah, I sometimes feel like an imposter when it comes to being a maker because I can barely hold a screwdriver straight. But I admire those who do because I see them as intrinsic to every society, whether they're designing, integrated circuits or they're building a table. What I find most intriguing now is less the individuals who are inventive and ingenious, of which there are a few or maybe a number of, but more the people who are working to build the systems that can nurture and propagate and replicate what those individuals have done. Because too often in the past, and I'm sure you're familiar with this, you'd hear of a story of Onwoka Lumoto, this guy built a car, or this guy built a plane, or invented this or invented that, and you never hear about it again. And this is not just particular to the Southeast, this is a Nigerian-wide, Africa-wide challenge. So one of the takeaways from being involved in Maker Fair Africa for me and others was, how do we begin to encourage these spaces, virtual, physical, and otherwise, to become sort of a safe space for people of that disposition. And one of my favorite, quote unquote, safe spaces for that is actually in Aba. It's called the Colonial Innovation Center. founded by this young man called Tochukwu. It's CIC. And what CIC is doing is they're taking young people. They're doing a number of things. One is that there's a business aspect to it. There is an educational aspect to it. And there is a sort of practical, how do you implement it on the ground aspect to it, which are key components if you're going to get innovation going. And the Colonial Innovation Center, which I urge anyone who is watching to seek out, is building the kind of space that we need many more of. If we're going to move from what was described earlier as this sort of prototyping society or copycat society, not to say copycatting is wrong, but a system that moves from being able to copy, but also being able to do it on a scalable basis and on a sustainable basis. So Colonial Innovation Center is one of them. Another one is the Oluwaka Institute in Owerri, and which actually I believe is now certified, Oluwaka Institute of Technology. And then in Nsukka, there is this intermediate space called ROA Nigeria, R-O-A Nigeria, that is a partnership, if I'm correct, between the university and others to build a space where people can absorb the thinking that's happening in the university, but they can also be brought into contact with the way businesses are built and structured. And one of the startups from that particular institute, I think it's called ARON, Aron Drone Systems, is actually looking to build cargo drones that could be used for distributing supplies regionally. And then the last place, which is much younger, but has a similar sense in the need to bring together all these elements, is Nzukọ Labs in Enugu. But once again, we haven't even scratched the surface. We need similar environments that foster agribusiness, agro-processing, chemicals, metalworks, biotech, pharmaceuticals, and so on. And some of these spaces need to be like the ones I mentioned, where they stand alone. Some of them hopefully will work with institutions of higher learning. Some of them will learn with post-high school institutions, because it's not just about Indigene University, it's about those who have the ability to build with their hands, but might not necessarily be interested in pursuing degrees. So those are the systems that I think are critical for us. You know, I would like to use examples, but not for the wrong reasons. And I'm going to refer to Israel. And I'm referring to Israel not because of any Jewish connection that some people might have, which doesn't add up, but more to how they've taken systems like the camaraderie in their army to build the type of thinking and innovative thinking that could then be used in business. But one of the things that they had to focus on was, how do we bring these necessary elements together? What do we have that no one else has that would form a foundation? And one of the things they had that no one else had when Israel was still a very young country in the 50s was very arid land, where there was not that much rainfall. It was very difficult to grow crops. Israel became a world leader in the irrigation of dry lands and an agricultural sector that was based on that kind of climate. So the point I'm trying to bring in here is, what is it about the Southeast that we have that could be seen as an impediment, but could be turned around into an advantage? Is it the concentration of trading in the 3 cities I mentioned earlier? Is it the cluster of schools in places like Enugu that could sort of complement each other. We have to look at the things that we have that no one else does, or if they have, don't have as well, and build that into the innovation systems. For those of you who might be familiar with Enugu, for example, there's a region in Enugu called Coal Camp, where beyond the spare parts that they once sold, they were very known for fabricating whatever you needed. Why haven't we set up a space that sort of speaks to the needs of those individuals and build off that, as opposed to setting up something that is fancy that will not last beyond the funding that is provided to it? So I may be going off on a tangent, but
no. I mean, it brings up a lot of food for thought.
Yeah, it's for me, it's about the systems now. The systems and the institutions that we need to focus on, much more so than the individual who comes up with something that is brilliant, because so many of those brilliant individuals end up being frustrated and somewhat unhappy that they produced whatever they produced, or they invented whatever they invented. And because they expected the government to step in, which inevitably they didn't, and even if they did, it was for a very short period of time, many of them end up being quite bitter about the whole experience. But if we're able to support the spaces I mentioned and build more of them, then those individuals, when they appear, will have a much more nurturing environment. And one last thing I'd like to mention is the role of women in all of this. I think that innovation, too often, everywhere in the world, but more so in our more recently patriarchal society, tends to overlook the level of innovation that happens with half the population. And this is innovation that in many cases is around food systems and areas that some consider less important. We need to find ways to bring along our girls, our women, as much as we're bringing along our young men and older people who are male. This has to be a concerted effort across all age groups and all genders. Innovation isn't just about science. It's about how do we take something like our Atilogu dance and take it to Broadway and build an industry out of that. But if you're not having the conversations with those individuals when we're speaking about innovation, people are just going to think it's about computers and engines, which is untrue. So I just wanted to sort of bring that in because it's easily overlooked.
Yeah, and I hope I answered your question. When you talk about innovation, their eyes glaze over and they think, oh, they're thinking technical.
Exactly. You know? The people who smoke fish and do it well, that could be a multi-billion-dollar industry right there. That, you know, I remember attending a fair a number of years ago in New York, a fancy food fair, and walking past the aisle for olive oil. No, it wasn't olive oil, it was for Italy or Greece. I can't remember exactly which country it was. And I was flabbergasted to see the number of companies that were in the olive oil business. We have not just palm oil, you can make an oil out of every single nut or vegetable that we have out there. The process of taking the palm oil and making 10 different grades of palm oil, that's innovation. And that's innovation that can provide employment for hundreds of thousands of people if it's done in a particular way. So this is I'm sort of tying innovation back to what matters to us now. What we know. What are our deficiencies today? Speaking of innovation and palm oil, there's a company called Brook Oil. I think it's spelled B-R-U-K oil, or Brook Oil Mills. that is actually in the business of building the machines that press the oil and turn it into a product. And it was founded by some young men whose names I don't have with me, but I can provide for later reference. Mm-hmm. And if I remember correctly, these individuals actually came from outside. They studied outside Nigeria, went to some fairly good schools outside Nigeria, but they saw the value in being able to innovate with something so fundamental back here. And the funny thing is that there are conglomerates and businesses that are going to be built from these things that we overlook because we do not attach the same understanding of innovation to them that we should. We tend to see innovation as that thing that is flying in the sky. No, mm-hmm. it's the person who can turn ogili into a business as big as soy oil, right? So we have to move from looking at it as something that exists up there to something that we hold in our hands or we encounter every day.
For example, all these things like bitter leaf or nubo, some people, swear by it to be used for, sort of medicinal purposes. So there's just so many things. And as you were talking, I just remembered about Malaysia. Someone was telling me, oh, Malaysia is, I was telling someone that Malaysians actually came to Nigeria to learn about palm oil. And the person said it was a lie. So as you were talking, I just remembered, when you talked about palm oil, and I just remembered how Malaysia has taken over the supply of palm oil to the world now. And this is something we could easily, sort of resurrect again.
Yes, and I like the fact that you used the word resurrect, because the title of this conversation, one of the words within the title of this conversation is recovery. And I think we're seeing a recovery process happen, but it's not happening at the pace that it could. When you mentioned Malaysia along with Indonesia are the largest producers of palm oil. And unbeknownst to a lot of people, palm oil is the most widely traded vegetable oil in the world. It's used in absolutely everything. But beyond even palm oil, which we can look to resurrecting and look to branding in ways that no one has thought of, you have a slew of indigenous vegetables. You mentioned bitter leaf that have medicinal qualities, but could also be used or potentially be used as a replacement for hops in beer. So my point is, if you went to Google Scholar and typed in any one of these items, you'll be surprised at the number of academic papers that have been written about them. What hasn't happened is translating this research, as we spoke to earlier, into products, into globally competitive businesses that produce the products. And that is what will bring prosperity, much more than any amount of oil or contract that we would get domestically. But for that to happen, there needs to be that connection between those who are curious, those who have done the research, and those who have the ability to move things from an idea and a research item to a viable product that could be used in any number of places or instances. So yes, the opportunities are there, but the systems need to be in place. And the spaces that I was referring to earlier are part of the puzzle that you need to get those systems in place.
Mm-hmm. Okay, as we all know, so many people are unemployed in Nigeria and in the Southeast Igbo land. And a lot of them are, sort of young people wondering what to do. All of them are looking for, sort of government job. And that brings up the next question. Because before you've spoken to the need for an entrepreneurial class Could you talk about why it's important?
Yes. Why is it important to have an entrepreneurial class? Well, part of it has to do with an understanding of how economies work. Because as a prelude to the question you just asked, you spoke to how people were looking for work, or they were looking to government to provide work for them. An entrepreneurial class, to a degree we already have in Igbo land, is some could argue that as a group, Igbos might have more of an entrepreneurial class than everyone else. That said, there seems to be a disconnect between our entrepreneurial class and what some might argue is the non-entrepreneurial class. So there are those, who speak English, as they say, and live in places like Enugu or are a middle class, and they don't see themselves as that well connected to these groups that you have, not just in places like Onitsha, Aba, and Nnewi, but in places like Lagos and any other cosmopolitan center in Africa, whether it's Sierra Leone, where I was recently, or Angola. You see groups of entrepreneurial Igbo people in all of these places, and even beyond Africa, Asia, and America, and so forth. But it's an entrepreneurial class that doesn't even seem to realize the potential clout it could have, because it hasn't connected its financial heft and its trading ability with the meaning of power. Everything is sort of isolated. If you look at large diaspora groups, I would say the most interesting diaspora groups from China, from the Indian subcontinent, from Lebanon, and one of the better known ones that has been around for thousands of years, the Jewish diaspora. There was a very strong connection between this merchant class and the intellectuals and the scientists. And whether it was something that was planned or intentional or laid out or organic, I'm not entirely sure, but it was this cohesiveness that gave them a certain power that I see lacking with the entrepreneurial and intellectual and scientific classes of the Igbo diaspora, both within and without. There's this lack of bridging between the various groups, and that lack of bridging has undermined its power to be politically powerful, not just domestically, but internationally. And the reason I also like to use the word entrepreneurial is that people who are entrepreneurial by their very nature tend to ask questions. They tend to be curious. They tend to be problem solvers. Because if you're not selling the product that you made or you got somewhere else, you're not going to put food on the table. So I see the word entrepreneurial being abused as something that people do because it's cool to be an entrepreneur. But for me, it boils down to something much more intrinsic, which is, to what degree are you problem solvers? To what degree do you see an issue and say, we're going to find a way around it? And that is what those folks that we were speaking to earlier in Biafra were doing. They had a problem and they had to solve it. They didn't say, well, where's the contract to make the bombs?
And they didn't have the luxury of time to even...
They didn't have the luxury of time. So one of the sad aspects of the Nigerian state is that it's turned many generations of Nigerians, or most Nigerians, this is not just particular to Igbo land, into those who are looking for others to solve their problems for them. So we have this very sort of disconnected citizenry that doesn't see a problem as something that they have to figure out. Mm-hmm. And entrepreneurs, by their nature, try to figure things out. Because if they don't figure things out, they don't survive. So when I'm speaking to an entrepreneurial class, I'm speaking more to that than it being people who are in the business of entrepreneurship. But to sort of absorb those attributes, you need to be fused or quite tightly coupled with those who do. And if you look at very effective diasporas, whether it's the non-resident Indians or the Chinese diaspora that for hundreds of years was doing what it was doing before China became the China it's become in the past 30 years, they became very effective because they were able to bring all these elements together. And in a sense, they sort of complemented each other. And till you have that, you're going to have people going off in various directions. And at the end of the day, essentially not getting anywhere. And that is my sort of understanding about having an entrepreneurial class, because an entrepreneurial class also will not take the kind of nonsense from bad leadership that we seem to be taking at the moment, because people are bought off, they celebrate things they shouldn't be celebrating. They become much more cohesive because they know how to solve problems. At least that's my thinking.
Okay. So what thoughts do you have on the, sort of the business class in fostering an innovation pipeline?
Yes, we've touched upon it somewhat earlier. The reason I feel this is important is if you look at the great commercial concerns of today, whether it's the $1.3 or $1.5 trillion valued Apple computing, or Alibaba that I mentioned earlier, or Tesla, or companies that are not publicly traded but are massive, like ADM or Olam. Olam is out of Singapore, even though it was founded in West Africa. One of the reasons these concerns are the way they are is because they have a philosophy that is about innovation. When we look at the commercial concerns in our part of the world, they consist of people who are smart, who are flexible, who are risk takers, but to the extent that they're innovative, the jury is still out. Because if they were, we wouldn't be in a position where it seems as if with each generation, the companies of the previous generation are not the companies we have today. And I know this is not just about innovation. It has to do with continuity and structures and governance and all of those things, which others have spoken to. But there needs to be an understanding of why you have to innovate, and why, if you bring people in, if they're not innovative, your company is not going to be nimble. It's going to die, because there are others who will come in and eat your lunch over time. You only have this window where the opportunity exists. And when that window is gone, there are others who try to do what you were doing or even do it better. So this is not something our commercial concerns and business people should run away from, because it's the very thing that's going to guarantee their long-term survival. Andy Grove, one of the founders of Intel, wrote a very famous, I don't know if it was a book or if it was an essay, about how only the paranoid survive. And he wasn't meaning paranoid as, oh, they're going to come and shoot me or kidnap me. No, it was more paranoia that what I made today, someone is going to make something twice as good tomorrow. And I think that the Igbo business class has been able to survive under the toughest of circumstances. But there seems to be this limiting factor around how innovative they are. And the degree to which that can be embedded in their organizations will actually, in my opinion, be an advantage. And who knows, maybe there's an opportunity to do this by having some of the types of spaces we spoke to earlier working with them. or having them fund spaces like that. I don't know. But I think we need more cooperation and interaction where you don't have the successful business people over here looking at the startup folks over there and the traders saying, what are those funny people doing over there? We need so much more cross-pollination, effective cross-pollination between all these groups if we're going to build the types of concerns that I think we need to build to hold our own.
Okay, 2 years ago, I gave a talk at Enugu Sports Club, and what formed the basis of my talk is that in earlier, like 100 years ago in Igbo land, women were the traders, women were the, sort of the ones pushing commerce. And women were more powerful prior to, the colonials coming. So what I want to ask you next is, okay, right now it's not so. Women, as we know, more like marginalized. So what I want to ask you now, what are we losing out by not having women in the business of innovation?
Well, I sort of
I know you've talked about it before.
Yeah, I touched upon it. We're losing out tremendously. And we need to find ways for women to recover the ground that they lost over the past 100 years or so. It will make us stronger if we find ways to do it. It's like you're fighting a battle with one hand tied behind your back when you don't fully incorporate everybody. That's what we're losing. You're fighting or producing things, you're at 50% of your capacity. I think that's the most literal way to look at it.
Yes, because women are 50% of the population.
Exactly. And you're talking in terms of mind share, you're talking in terms of perspective, you're talking in terms of the workforce itself. It's interesting because we were not patriarchal prior to the onset of colonialism. If anything, a lot of this patriarchy is a result of the Victorians and so on. So there's a certain equivalence that we need to build back up. And I think one of the ways to foster this is to support systems that are being built or could be built by women in areas of commerce and industry across the board. I don't think there should be any favoritism given to any group. We should just have people who shine, have the support that is necessary, and encourage them to. And when we see those who are doing the work, rally around them. So till we bring the numbers up to where they could be, we'll be at a loss. And I'm not just speaking about people working in these spaces or industries or companies. I'm speaking about the market women. How do we bring those systems of market women into these spaces where their collective financial and productive worth can be enhanced? The cooperatives that we could build with these various groups. So not doing so is actually self-defeating and self-marginalizing. And culturally and otherwise, we need to find ways to overcome it. Not just in terms of the culture wars, but in terms of commerce. Because if we as Africans in general, Nigerians in general, Igbos in particular, do not build power bases of commerce, we're not going to be at the table with anyone else. The struggle we see in the world today that is becoming much more nationalist. You're in the UK, I'm in the US. all these countries are taking a turn for it's about them, it's not about others. It's a less forgiving world that we're stepping into. It's a world that is less ready to care about anyone else. And societies that do not build the financial and commercial heft and industry are going to be very, very vulnerable in a world that is becoming a lot more scary. So it behooves us to bring to the table all of our assets, which includes half the population, if we're going to fight or at least stand steadfast about what seems to be simmering on the margins.
Okay, so are traditional educational institutions equipped to foster prosperity at a time of rapid change?
No, they are not.
Yeah.
And in many ways, they become a problem. The role they should be playing, we were speaking about Enugu earlier on. Enugu, I don't know how many schools Enugu has, but to what
Millions,
degree?
if not thousands.
Yeah. So, but the question we need to be asking ourselves is, what happens with the people who leave these schools? Are they leaving these schools to build society? Are they leaving these schools to create systems that employ people? We should call these institutions to account. If you have an institution that the employment rate of its graduates, unemployment rate, is in the 90s and 80s, what's the point of having that school? All you're doing is creating unrealistic expectations with young people who quickly become disillusioned. You create a sense of entitlement for people who feel they were educated, but really are not able to do anything of practical value. So I think we need to hold these schools responsible. We should put their feet to the fire and ask hard questions. How many of your students are employed? How much wealth has your school generated post-employment? How many companies were created by graduates of your school? Because the schools that a lot of elite Nigerians want to send their children to outside Nigeria answer those questions. When you hear of MIT, one of the first metrics or statistics you hear about MIT is the economy of MIT, the number of companies MIT graduates have created. Those are the things these schools are being valued by. That's the same with Oxbridge. What you don't hear is that we graduated students. This is not an egg production factory, because we're ruining the lives of these young people if we do not equip them, and we're ruining the future of the country if people are unable to be productive. And the more young people you have that are not productive, the more treacherous the society becomes. This is subject matter that others have spoken to much more eloquently than I have. But the thing is, there's no point having 1 million schools if there's no value post-graduation for those schools. And I'm speaking not just about tertiary education, I'm speaking about primary education. We need to have yardsticks and metrics that ask really hard questions. And if those questions are not answered, then something needs to be done, and done quickly, because we have a window that's closing to get these things right. And the traditional institutions, I'm sorry to say, have failed. Here and there, you see a few initiatives that are worthy, like earlier on I mentioned rural Nigeria that is at UNN, but we need like 1,000 of those types of efforts. Having one is it's literally insignificant in the larger.
And then again, when there's more, then they become more competitive. Each one is striving to,
yes,
get better than the other.
The competition shouldn't be oh, we have X number of graduates with first class honors. It should be, our graduates have gone on to build future companies, build future institutions. So it's also good for the school, because if they're financially successful,
yeah, because the alumni will come back. Yeah,
they become the seed corn for future endowments. Harvard, Stanford, the endowments don't come from government. The endowments come from largely very, very successful alumni. So if you don't play a role in making your graduates and your students very successful, and then later on you're complaining that no one is thinking of the school, I think these schools need to put up a mirror and look very harshly at themselves and ask why. Those that change that behavior will see results that will pay dividends fairly quickly. And this is what we should be looking at, in my opinion. So I'm not trying to be too harsh here, but the schools have largely failed and they need to course correct.
Mm-hmm. Okay. There's been a tremendous success in sort of in the creative industry, like Nollywood, literature, music, and so much more. So how do you think innovation can catalyze and amplify these fields, sort of even more?
The creative spaces have been the one area that we're so proud about, because despite almost absolutely no support from the Nigerian state, it's the one area that we have consistently been proud about, whether it's our writers, our filmmakers, and performance artists across various fields. So firstly, I'd like to applaud individuals in this space for sort of flying the flag of excellence and ability and creativity and all of those things at the highest possible levels. There's nothing that we lack in terms of the quality of the work that is coming from these areas compared to where we're lagging. So I think it's important to acknowledge that. I would like to see more nonfiction. I think we need to see more stories about, for example,
everyday stories, yeah.
Everyday stories about what was commerce, the women who built commerce in pre-colonial Nigeria. What was that about? I think that, but that's just a personal aside for me. In terms of innovation, it ties in with what I was saying earlier on. We scratched the surface, but boy, is that surface 10 miles wide. Mm. For each one of our folklore stories, there's a Lion King waiting to be made. So once again, I'm talking about the system of wealth creation, the system of not just there's a book, but to what extent, and we're beginning to see that, can the book be translated into a film? Can that film be turned into a series? And it's happening, but it's not happening as much as, or it's happening as quickly as some of us would want. But perhaps technology will enable us to do this even more so. You are a publisher, Chioma, yourself, in the area of language. And innovation, I would argue, has assisted you in that quest to move beyond what would just have been a book sitting on a shelf to something that could be packaged for not just an audience in a particular geographical area, but globally, and not necessarily just for people who are of Igbo heritage. So these opportunities, I think, could and already are assisting the creative space, but we're not completely there yet. And the degree to which we can speed and accelerate that process, the better. Because the more we can inject resources into this space that in my opinion, is doing better than many others, that velocity of financial liquidity will impact all these other spaces. And I think it's not a case of, well, we have one book or two books that have been turned into novels and into films and into podcasts. We need 5,000 more of them. And even the stories that have been told can be retold 20 times. The West does that all the time.
They do that every time. And people don't realize that companies like Disney use stories in the public domain, and then they rehash it. And then, you know, for example, we could take the most important one, the famous one in Igbo land, the tortoise. I mean, what stops us from creating stories with a tortoise using a mobile phone or doing something in the modern world, you know?
Exactly.
So,
and the Igbos are very well known for their idioms. And idioms can be animated. They can be repackaged. They have a power that we're not even utilizing if you looked at the full sort of landscape of multimedia.
Because they're essentially mini stories, and they also encapsulate our worldview at the same time.
In very sort of brief and pithy ways. So the full range of media, whether it's on our device in our hands or it's in the cloud, and whether it's a theatrical production, we haven't even begun to exploit it. But there are ways to do it differently that didn't exist 20 years ago. I remember watching these kodo drummers from Japan who traveled the world globally. And these guys just were very maniacal drummers, right? And I think of the various instrumentalists that we have in Igbo land that are equivalent to folks like that.
Like but the Ogene people and the
exactly,
people playing Oja, so many things.
But what has happened with these societies is that they've found ways to package their work and disassemble it in ways that we could too. And we could too with less resources than were required in the past. So there's just a plethora of material, cultural material, that technology now enables us to access in ways we couldn't in the past, that I think more of us should take advantage of. And fortunately, the examples exist. So it's not a case of you have to learn it from scratch. It's already being done. So I think the already burgeoning cultural space will actually do much better in the future if we find more ways to accelerate the process. And if we find ways to take that into the world of commerce. You mentioned Disney. What does Disney do? Our folklore can create everything Disney has and more if we are able to put these elements in place.
Because they don't even make their money from the films. It's the merchandising. That's exactly where their money is, yeah. So anyway, let's move ahead. A number of countries and city-states could be characterized as startup nations or cities or regions. How can Igbo become one of them?
Yes, and thanks for that question. I read a book called Startup Nations, and other people have, but it was based on what the country of Israel had done. But not only Israel, you see similarities in Singapore, Hong Kong, some might argue Dubai. And these locations, they have a number of similarities that we could we could sort of look at, because if we were able to build on what we already had and said to ourselves, okay, when I say we, I'm speaking about the Southeast, there are these elements of an interest in trade and a certain openness, you know, because Igbos generally had to leave their part of the country and travel everywhere else for reasons that might have to do with population density and the fertility of the land. Igbos are actually very open. They're very accommodating. They are not that suspicious of outsiders, contrary to what many people might think. There's a certain openness that you have. There's also this sort of industriousness that comes with all these constraints, and need and an interest in learning the languages of others, almost to a fault, where many people, myself included, aren't as fluent as we should be, because there hasn't been as much focus as there should on what is intrinsically ours. The educational aspect, even though as many would argue our education is not what it could be, but generally speaking, Igbos are a group that feel knowledge matters. And when you look at these startup nations or startup city-states, the key startup nation people will say is Israel, they don't also have resources. Israel had no oil. They barely had any water. They had some of the most infertile land out there. So they had to use their most important resource was what resided between their ears, their brains. And brains are useful if they're individual, but they're actually more powerful if collectively you can harness that brain power. And this somewhat ties into what I was speaking to earlier about bringing the diaspora together, bringing these segments together where the dance instructor, the person who knows what he or she knows about the Atilogo and Punkti dance group, sees the value in someone who has studied dance in the UK. But that person is then saying, well, we're not that good at marketing, but we know someone who went to some of the best schools in the world and is a guru in marketing to build something collectively. And some would argue that that is a startup. It's a startup way of thinking, where you're bringing together teams of individuals, teams of people to address market opportunities wherever they exist. And if you do that if you're able to replicate that process enough, you form the foundation and the basis for what could be a startup nation. A startup nation is not going to come from a communique, which our leaders seem to be fond of. It's not going to be a diktat from State House. No. If we had governments that were effective, and I'm not going to get into bashing our governments because, in my opinion, at least for the time we're here together, that's not productive. I would say the state had a really important role to play here. But till we have those kinds of governments, we need to find ways to sort of do that with the cards we've been dealt. And the degree to which we can assemble these kinds of teams of people across various industries, various institutions, if we're able to be successful at that over time, which I think we can, then you have the foundation or the feedstock for what could be a startup nation. If we had effective governance, yes, we would sit down with the people who call themselves governors. I call themselves governors, but I don't consider them to be governors because they don't act like governors. And people in the legislative arm and the local government arm, and say, these are the things we need to put in place. But that doesn't seem to be the case, but it doesn't mean we shouldn't work towards it by doing what we can while we wait for that to fall in place. And a startup nation is a nation that thinks like that, a nation that is cohesive in terms of thinking what its product could be. And in this case, its product is its people who go on to create, build, and structure and deploy in the educational space, in the business space, in the health space, and so forth. So that could be the roadmap toward a startup nation while we're waiting for the governance and politics situation to settle itself. But till then, I think these could be some of the measures we could embark upon to begin the process of solving the problems with what we have and not wait for things to be perfect.
Okay, and for my final question, what role do you see for bottom-up development?
It's everything. I think we mentioned women earlier, and I mentioned market women. The salt of the earth are critical for us to build whatever needs building. What do I mean by that? You know, the women now quose in the market, the men who are the engines of rice production or yam production, they constitute the bulk of our population, or the petty trader. Their numbers are much more than those who sit in cafes and discuss, you know, whatever is sexy on Twitter. The degree to which those people are part of the conversation that we're having today is critical if we're to make progress. No societies have moved if they haven't included those individuals all along the way. We need to have them there while these decisions are being made. And there's a reason for this, because our politicians have already figured out how to get to the people who are the salt of the earth. The thing is, they only get to them every 4 years. And the people who mean well or have the discussions that I believe we are trying to have at this event haven't found a way to connect to those individuals that form the bulk of society. So what then happens is when the political class does what it does, they know they have them in their pocket and they just are able to control that conversation. So not having the bottom-up constituency or the people at the bottom as part of the conversation has actually undermined the ability of various groups to achieve meaningful power, economic and political power. And speaking the language that is understood in those areas where the basic necessities are difficult is critical if society is going to move forward in lockstep. So I don't know how to go about doing that in terms of, you know, a single or a few answers, but this is something that has to be part of the process. The process must be something that when the traders in Onitsha, the markets in Onitsha, the shoemakers or leather producers in Aba, or the spare parts folks in Nnewi and all the others in between, how do that bulk of the Igbo foundational space become part of the conversation? Until we're able to do that, we'll be having this conversation 10 years from now, because it's going to be a conversation that is up there in the ether, but doesn't trickle down to where it should. If anything, it should be trickling up. And if you look at societies that have been able to change socially, they were able to do it. Whether it's the Scandinavians, whether it's the Chinese, the mechanisms were different. Once again, we have to discover those mechanisms ourselves. We can't copy and paste and expect it to work because the language is very different. The ways of being are very different. And the extent to which innovation and ingenuity will be a feature and a factor here, I don't know exactly how, but it's something that needs exploring from both ends. But one of the ways you do that is by bringing those individuals to the table and having them speak in an unfiltered way, so that they can be heard, we can hear them, and they can hear us, and we can speak or deliver something together that is meaningful and impactful. So I don't know, but that's my sort of woolly, vague sense of things.
This has been a fantastic conversation. So many nuggets. I think every 5 seconds there's something so valuable that someone, you watching out there, can use and grow from here. Thank you so much, Emeka. And of course, I'm not even going to ask you. You are going to come to the next installment of Igbo conference. Hopefully, we're hoping Nsukka will still hold next year. So, we look forward to seeing you again on Igbo conference.
I don't know if I'll have much more to say that hasn't already been said, but I look forward to being in Nsukka and having conversations with people. I think we need more of these types of interactions, and it's fun, to say the least. So thanks you again, Chioma.
Yeah, thank you
for having me.
Thank you.